Right, so there was definitely a feeling of unease last night here at UK time, as it looked like after months of threats and amid a ceasefire deal that had suddenly gone sideways for Benjamin Netanyahu, he was ordering the IDF into Rafah, the last refuge of the Gazan people, pretty much, as 1.6 million of them are trapped there, kettled I believe is the term, cornered with nowhere to go, half of the people shielding there with no more than tents for protection, now being bombed despite Hamas having literally agreed to release hostages as part of that same ceasefire deal that Netanyahu now all of a sudden doesn't like. The scale of death and destruction that could now be meted out in a very short space of time, for no other reason than for Netanyahu to keep his grip on power, would be unparalleled to anything we've witnessed since October 7th previously. And this is so appallingly preventable. Our leaders in our countries, our nations, could have intervened long before now. Instead, they chose to be on his side. If, as feared, Netanyahu does the unthinkable and goes into Rafah, all guns blazing, so to speak, this crime will be on them too, for standing aside, for casting a blind eye, for continuing to aid and abet and supply that regime as they have with arms and military aid. Israel is a pariah state, an apartheid state, a rogue state, and anyone still supporting them in a position of power needs to end up in the Hague with them, should the worst now come to pass. Right, so going to bed last night, a lot of us with a sense of empathy, I suppose, had a cold feeling in the pits of our stomachs with scenes of tanks and explosions already happening on the outskirts of Rafah. There was a genuine fear as to what we thought, or certainly I thought, we might be waking up to this morning, and already it is scenes of absolute horror. But it's also something that, sadly, as much as we've been dreading, we've been expecting it too. Despite the devastation north to south in the Gaza Strip that's been going on since October 7th, at no point has there been a concerted global pushback from world leaders to condemn Israel in that time for what it is doing. There have been pockets of it, South Africa, going to the Hague, Nicaragua, a few others who have actually sought to uphold international law, whilst other signatories to said laws have ignored it, seeking instead to carry on their support for the racist, colonialist project in the Middle East called Israel, who can do whatever clearly, obviously, by their actions they like and suffer no real consequences. It is no wonder they act like spoilt children anytime somebody chooses to criticise them for what they are doing. They have committed mass acts of genocide already and still claim they are the victims. I truly am sickened by the attitudes of many of them, but not least their mad government and their power-tripping Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. It takes a special kind of deranged to start bombing a community of 1.6 million people, most of which are living in tents, but you're in a whole new class of your own when you're negotiating for a ceasefire at the same time. Where Hamas have already agreed to this ceasefire deal, that I went over in a video yesterday, that completely wrong-footed Netanyahu, thinking they would never agree to it, because there was no permanence written into the ceasefire as yet Hamas did go along with it. And it is Netanyahu now faced with the position of saying the hostages come first, of Hamas having agreed to this deal where hostages will be released, and now Netanyahu by his actions, not his words, clearly showing the hostages are completely meaningless to him. Not that his statement issued yesterday afternoon our time makes any of that clear. Statement from the Prime Minister's office. The War Cabinet unanimously decided this evening Israel will continue its operation in Rafah in order to apply military pressure on Hamas so as to advance the release of our hostages and achieve the other objectives of the war. They have a ceasefire deal on the table that Hamas have already agreed to. That would lead to all the hostages being released, and still Netanyahu claims he's got to go into Rafah to release the hostages. Could have just agreed to the ceasefire now, and hostages could have been starting to be released today without a single shot having been fired. So let's not pretend this is about hostages. It never has been. This is about him retaining his grip on power. And no amount of bloodshed is a price too high to pay for that, it would appear. Israel have already killed more hostages than they've saved. More will surely die, assuming they are being held in Rafah. We don't know with certainty, but certainly with more civilians will. So far, at time of writing, a full invasion of Rafah has not yet happened, though we fear we're on the verge of seeing that. But what we have seen overnight has been bad enough. IDF tanks have entered Rafah now, and are now sat 200 metres from the Rafah border crossing with Egypt, and they've closed it completely, taken control of it, all on the basis that they apparently had intelligence it was being used for terrorist purposes. Yeah, they played that card again. Sure, why would we possibly doubt you when you've said that? Israel have now got control of that crossing. All aid has therefore been stopped from entering the Strip. More people will now die as a direct result of that, already being in famine as they are. Overnight, there have been 3 strikes on different parts of Rafah itself, and 12 people have been killed. And yet Israel are now telling people to evacuate the area. Where to exactly? Back to Khan Yunis, towards the coast? How are they supposed to get there? They are literally trapped in Rafah. They can go nowhere. There is no route for them. All this narrative serves is to allow Israel to say, well, we told them to go. But anyone saying that they can't go anywhere or could go anywhere will no doubt be denounced as an anti-Semite. It's a fact, though. What route have you provided for them to leave Rafah? And where are they actually going to go to? And what guarantees have they got they're going to be safe getting there? Absolutely nowhere. Are the tanks parked on Egypt's lawn ready to blow the border crossing and allow people to flee into Egypt, maybe? Certainly it'd be a better outcome than the alternative. But are these people worth the political fallout for Netanyahu with Egypt? They don't seem worth much at all to him, after all. Equally, though, his actions then reflect and incriminate all those who have supported him, his regime and his government, in their apparent support for Israel, the nation, but conflating the two, on one hand does a disservice to the great many Israelis out protesting against Netanyahu, when they won't, but also shames and appalls people in this country and on the international stage when our leaderships are so out of kilter with our views. Here in the UK, last week's local elections have given both the Tories and to a slightly lesser extent Labour both bloody noses in regards to their pro-Israeli support. But if, as feared, a catastrophic Israeli strike on Rafah happens now, and especially in light of Netanyahu having spurned a ceasefire deal with Hamas who have accepted it, there will be no forgiveness or forgetting what our leaders say or do now, because if the likes of Biden or Sunak or Starmer, von der Leyen, all the others who have ardently supported Israel from the beginning don't change their tune here and now, end arms supplies, back BDS, condemn Israel for the rogue nation that it is, then each of them belong in the dock of the Hague alongside Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant and whoever else is facing an arrest warrant right now, or could be further down the line. So far, Keir Starmer has on social media just repeated the need for a ceasefire, something his party previously sabotaged, of course. Release of hostages and aid to be let in. I really don't know how many more times these calls must be ignored before he wakes up and says something different, something else, something that might actually be meaningful. Biden is no better. Nobody has supported Israel more. And for as much as I've slammed Keir Starmer there, at time of writing, Rishi Sunak has said absolutely nothing concerning last night's events, issuing no statement thus far on what is happening as we speak. That isn't to say some are not speaking out from within the main parties. For example, Sadiq Khan, the newly elected London mayor, has last night called for an arms embargo on Israel, going far further than anyone else in Starmer's Labour, certainly in a position of authority as he is, has been prepared to go up until now. But I won't be expecting that same sentiment to come from Starmer himself. More globally, at the UN General Assembly has a draft resolution before it which could be voted on as early as Friday to recognise Palestine as a full member state. You might recall the US on the UN Security Council vetoed that the other week. Should this draft resolution pass, the UN Security Council will then be asked to reconsider its decision. Big deal, you might think. But should Rafah be assaulted at the level it is feared it is about to be, then Biden would be literally throwing the presidency away, I would imagine, by issuing that veto again. It seems weak, but Israel may well see it happen because of their own actions. There's a get-out clause for the US legally there, though, as Israel's UN representative Gilad Erdan has pointed out, though. However, the court of public opinion will be a much harsher judge. Israel's ambassador to the UN, Gilad Erdan, has denounced a UN General Assembly, UNGA, draft resolution that would recognise Palestine as qualified to become a full UN member, saying it goes against the organisation's founding charter. If it is approved, I expect the United States to completely stop funding the UN and its institutions in accordance with American law, Erdan said. US law stipulates that Washington can't fund any UN body if it grants full membership to any group that lacks internationally recognised attributes of statehood. Well, Biden would be a fool to hide behind that one, I think, especially when international law trumps American domestic law at any rate. Fundamentally, as I said in this video recommendation here from yesterday, Netanyahu opting to end the war and agree to a ceasefire would mean he finally has to be held accountable for his actions. This might be why Hamas chose to accept a deal they weren't looking likely to without a permanent ceasefire. Surely it's obvious to everyone now, therefore, that there can be no peace, no end to what is happening in Gaza, and indeed the West Bank as well, whilst Netanyahu remains in charge. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.